So welcome to the latest webinar offered by the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center. I'm Tim Devine, the National Park Service representative at the Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center, and your host for today's webinar. I'm assisted by Elaine Poser, who some of you have already heard from, and also Holly Metzger. They'll be helping with some technical support. So if you have any technical issues along the way, just go ahead and private chat them, and they'll do what they can to assist you. So wilderness areas are not immune to the changing climate. As you can see from some of these pictures on the slide here, the receding glaciers, the forests that are dying, the wildlife that may be losing some of their habitat like the pika or the sea turtle with sea level rise. And then the activity of fires that we've been seeing here and longer fire seasons. It's a very popular topic, as evident by, we've had over 250 people register for this webinar. So as stewards of our most enduring resource, managers must understand the effects of climate change and the long-lasting impacts that decisions and actions that they take. There's a cost of doing something and there's a cost of doing nothing. So what do you gain? What do you lose? To help us walk through some of this today, our presenters are Sean Parks and Dave Lawrence. Sean is a research ecologist with the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute in Missoula, Montana. He's interested in the relationship between fire and climate and restoring fire as a natural process, the spatial interactions between past wildland fire and subsequent fire events. Sean often uses data collected in wilderness to conduct his studies, thereby using wilderness as a natural laboratory. Dave is a climate change scientist with the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program in Fort Collins, Colorado, specializing in aquatic ecology. In this role, Dave conducts and translates climate change research to support forward-looking land and water management. He's actively collaborating in efforts to support management of landscapes and undergoing ecosystem transformation to assist the adaptive capacity of species to climate change. Sean's first going to explore the challenges of managing wilderness in a changing climate, then followed by Dave talking about the resist, accept, direct, or RAD decision framework as a tool to assist in making informed, purposeful choices about responding to conditions of continuous change. We'll have time at the end for questions you may have. So if you have a question for either of them, please type it into the chat at any time during the presentation, and we'll get to those at the end once Sean and Dave finish up. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean, and he will start from there. Take it away, Sean.
Hi, everybody. Yes, I'm Sean. And Tim, is my presentation showing up?
In the notes form again.
In the notes form again. Look at that.
It reverted.
How is that? Is that better?
No, it didn't come up yet.
Oh. It says my screen sharing is paused. That's not cool. I'm going to start this. I'm going to try this again, okay? We did all this practicing ahead of time, and look, look where we are. Okay.
It'll come up.
Okay. Is it the real slideshow or the notes?
Notes again.
Notes. Okay. I don't know why, but it says my screen sharing is paused. So I think I'm just going to go with the notes version, okay?
Okay, that's fine.
It seems kind of strange it's doing that. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. Or if I just do that. Okay. Yeah, as Tim mentioned, yeah, I'm Sean Parks. I work for the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. And I'm excited you're all here. So thanks for being here. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Just a little background on our institute real quick. We are in Missoula, Montana, on the campus of the University of Montana, and we are administratively housed within the Rocky Mountain Research Station, which is part of U.S. Forest Service Research and Development. But we do have a multi-agency mandate in that we conduct science that's relevant to all wilderness areas, no matter what agency is managing it. We also receive some funding from all the agencies, which is great. So again, even though I am technically Forest Service, I am willing and excited to work on wilderness for other agencies. And just, you know, about me, I work in wilderness, about wilderness, but I have a love of wilderness and have since I was a child. I recreated there as a kid. I'm continuing to recreate there now with my own kids. So a passion about wilderness in work and in life. Anyway, let's get into climate change. I'm sure a lot of you have seen figures like this, right? On the left, we see that the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration is skyrocketed in recent decades. We're currently at about 414 parts per million. And we haven't been at 414 parts per million for over 4 million years, or about 4 million years. So that's a long time, you know, so that we're kind of in unprecedented territory in terms of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And this drastic increase in carbon dioxide is also leading to an increase in global temperatures. And you can see that we're about 1 degree Celsius above our baseline temperatures. And this is only going to increase without something, you know, drastic reduction or elimination of fossil fuels, which is not likely to happen in the near term. So this 1 degree Celsius is likely to continue. And, you know, as we're seeing warmer temperatures, we're seeing the effects, and we're expecting to see more effects in the future. We're seeing, you know, an increase in area burned and fires. We're seeing droughts. We're seeing heat waves. You know, the heat wave that hit the Pacific Northwest this last summer was striking and terrifying. It reached 113 or 115 degrees in Portland, which is, yeah, terrifying. So climate change is here. And we are coming to the realization that every ecosystem on the planet is going to become transformed by climate change. I'm just going to circle this quote here, that if nations fail to rein in their greenhouse gas emissions, nearly every terrestrial ecosystem on the planet, from forests to grasslands to marshlands, will undergo major transformations that will completely change the world's biomes. And, you know, in terms of wilderness and climate change, climate change is perhaps wilderness's greatest challenge, as posited here in this paper by Nate Stevenson and Connie Millar. It was published nearly a decade ago. But there's some key quotes from the abstract that I thought were worth highlighting here. You know, the first is that, you know, basically we can no longer deny that climate change is occurring. And the second quote is that wilderness stewards will be increasingly confronted with the trade-off between untrammeled wilderness character and primeval natural conditions, accompanied by increasing impetus for management intervention. And that's basically the crux here, or the greatest challenge. There's a trade-off between untrammeled character and natural conditions. These words, untrammeled and natural, are two key tenets of the Wilderness Act. And it's impossible, basically, to have untrammeled wilderness character and natural wilderness conditions with climate change. So there's a trade-off here. And that's why climate change is wilderness's greatest challenge. The last point here about planning responses will be challenging by the unprecedented and unpredictable nature of future changes. You know, climate change is happening. We know that. However, we are not very good at knowing exactly how the effects are going to manifest, where they're going to manifest, or when they're going to manifest. So there's a lot of uncertainty at what climate change is going to bring us, and it makes it challenging for wilderness managers and you know, everybody else in the world too. I gave a similar talk a few months ago, and I asked everybody what the biggest threats to wilderness under climate change are. And this was a interactive word cloud. So people typed in their words, and it automatically filled it in. So I'm just showing you the results of that past interactive word cloud. Thinking about threats to wilderness. And you can see what's kind of popping up. The bigger words are more responses: that invasive species, sea level rise, habitat loss, and drought. Fire occurs in here several times, but people use different words, so it didn't pop out as very big. But fire is also a big threat according to this word cloud. So I want to talk about some of this stuff, like the sea level rising thing. You know, we've got those cute little sea turtles that Tim showed at the beginning. So you know, these low elevation coastal areas have sensitive habitat. They have rare plants. There's unique habitats, and climate change is rising the sea levels at 10 to 30 centimeters per decade. And that might not seem like a lot, but after several decades, you can see how that adds up. And you know, a few feet of sea level rise is a lot of habitat lost and a lot of impacts to our coastal communities, our coastal natural communities, and our coastal human-dominated communities as well. And water temperatures are increasing, and this is a big deal if you know, for cold water species like trout and salmon. You know, and the species that also rely on them, like bears. You know, bears eat the salmon, and the salmon need the cold water. So it's kind of climate change is increasing the water temperatures. And one thing I think is interesting is shown in the bottom right figure here, where there's a direct and an indirect impact of climate change on water temperatures. First, as the air temperature rise, the water temperature increases as well, right? But and that's a direct effect. And there's also an indirect effect of decreased snowpack. Decreased snowpack means less water going into the system and less cold water is infused in the system. And so we end up with increasing temperatures. So there's this direct and indirect impact. And we see this, the climate change has direct and indirect impacts to lots of systems across the globe. One thing I think is kind of interesting here is that the kind of the externalities of climate change in terms of water temperature. Say, for example, I think a lot about the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness in central Idaho. There's salmon there. Say, just for argument's sake, that the water temperatures in the Frank Church Wilderness are going to be fine and cold enough for salmon in the future. However, if way down here by the ocean or in the lower elevations, the water is too warm for the salmon, they can't even get up there. They can't even get to the wilderness. So no matter what we do in the wilderness, there's like these external forces that could be happening a long way away, or impediments to movement that could prevent salmon from reaching the wilderness. So I think that's another interesting way to think about the kind of the connected systems that we have oftentimes, and how climate change can impact our connected systems. And then, of course, glaciers are receding and disappearing. I joke sometimes, it might not be very funny, that we're going to have to change the name of Glacier National Park to the park formerly known as Glacier National Park. That's a joke in reference to the musical artist Prince. If anyone gets it, I'm sure you think it's hilarious. And we're starting to see big changes in our ecosystems. And here's an example from the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. And here we have large expanses of forest that were killed by beetles in the late 80s and early 1990s. And that area subsequently burned and now looks like a totally transformed ecosystem. It's a non-forest ecosystem. It's hard to imagine this area returning to forest at any time in the in the foreseeable future. And this is just kind of a good example of the ecological theory of changing of states and of disturbance that's shown here in the top right. You can think of that this ball is our ecosystem. And under a stable climate or historical climate, this forested ecosystem could take some perturbations. It could handle some fire, it can handle some beetle kill, but it's always going to bounce back to a forested state. But under climate change, you can see the kind of the walls become more shallow, and it's much easier for this forested ecosystem to kind of bounce over into this non-forested state. And once it's in this non-forested state, it's really hard to get back out of it. It's hard to return to a forested state. And I think the example I'm showing in the slide overall is a good example of a compound disturbance and how it affects or how it can cause these ecosystem transitions. A compound disturbance would be two short interval disturbances that are kind of, that can take your ecosystem and move it to a different state. So in this example, the first disturbance was the beetle killed trees. The beetles came in and killed nearly every tree over the large landscape. The second disturbance was the fire. And again, returning to a forested state is not likely here in the foreseeable future. We've done some research at the Institute to think about projected vegetation shifts under climate change. I'm going to show you an example here from the Yellowstone National Park and surrounding and adjacent wilderness areas. And we've made maps basically of what our reference period or historical vegetation looks like compared to vegetation under climate change. We've produced these maps for several large protected area complexes in North America, but I'm just showing you Yellowstone as an example. What we see, number one, is the maps look different. There's a lot less dark green in the right. Dark green is the cold montane forest, which in Yellowstone is lodgepole pine forest. We're seeing a lot more orange on the right, and orange is shrubland or a lot of sagebrush. And we see a near complete elimination of this light gray that's down here. And these are the alpine areas, the high elevation alpine areas. So, when we're thinking about climate change, there are winners and there are losers. So in this example, lodgepole pine's a loser, the sagebrush habitat's a winner, and there's species that are associated with each of these types of vegetation. So example, the high elevation alpine areas, the species there are losers because we're projected to lose nearly all of that habitat or that vegetation or that ecosystem type under climate change. And just some examples there from this particular area would be the pika and the mountain goat. So I will move on and shift to fire. Fire is something I spent a lot of time researching and thinking about. And it's important for thinking about ecosystem transitions under climate change, which I'll explain in a moment. But we're seeing the area burned has been increasing in the Western United States since the mid-1980s. And not only is area burned increasing, but area burned at high severity is increasing. And when I refer to high severity fire or standard placing fire, I'm referring to fires that occur in forests that kill pretty much most of the trees or all of the trees. So the vertical axis is logged here, so it's hard to tell, but there's been a six-fold increase in area burned since the 1980s or the mid-1980s. And there's been an eightfold increase in area burned at high severity since 1985. And this is important. I spent a lot of time thinking about high severity fire because I said it's got this ability to catalyze shifts from forest to non-forest. You can see the top two left pictures here show previous forested areas that were affected by stand replacing fire. The picture at the top right is just a friendly reminder that not all fire is bad or stand replacing. There are examples of low severity surface fire that are actually beneficial to forests. This particular picture was taken in the Gila wilderness in New Mexico, 1 year after the 2011 Miller fire. So most of the trees in that photo at the top right survived that 2011 Miller fire, at least in this photo. But back to the stand replacing fire and why things catalyze, or why there's shifts from forest on forest. There's two things going on here. The first is that, especially for dry forest types and certain tree species, we need seeds. We need a live tree to produce seeds to restart or to get recovery back to forest. And so the farther a site is from a live tree or a seed source, the less likely you're going to get seedlings, and the less likely you're going to recovery back to forest. So all things being equal, more stand replacing fire means you're farther from a seed source. The other thing going on here is that the post-fire climate is becoming increasingly unfavorable to seedling establishment and survival. Seedlings are very sensitive to dry conditions and hot temperatures. Adult trees can survive conditions that seedlings can't. So if our climate is becoming, in certain places, so hot and dry that seedlings are having a difficult time establishing. So it's basically a climate change double whammy. We're getting more high severity fire, and more high severity fire means we have more areas or more sites that are nowhere close to a seed source. And then even if there is a seed source present, seedlings are less likely to establish and survive because of these warm temperatures. We're starting to see these effects unfold a lot of places across the Western US in particular. Here's some photos I took from Bandelier Wilderness when I was there in 2016. You can see in these photos, there's pretty much not a conifer tree in sight to return these sites back to a ponderosa pine dominated forest. So again, it's hard to imagine these areas returning to ponderosa pine forest without some sort of intervention. And I'm sure you've all seen on the news or on social media some of the other examples that have that kind of are unfolding as fire activity continues to increase. I want to shift gears here and talk about climate change and species range shifts. A lot of you have probably seen these maps that are shown on the left, where we have an idea of where a species is, and we call that the geographic range. And using models, you can predict its future geographic range. And we have these maps that show areas where the species disappears and areas of range expansion is shown in the green. A couple of things to point out here. First of all, you can overlay the National Wilderness Preservation System or the Protected Area Network on here, and you can see that there's going to be projected range contraction and range expansion across that network for this species. Also remember that every single species is going to have a map that looks not exactly like this, but there's going to be, you can imagine that every species has a map of range contraction, no change, and range expansion. These maps and models are usually produced using climate data. And so we say that the green area basically means the future climate is suitable for this species. So even though the climate is suitable for that species, it's possible that species can't get to the green area. And I'm going to explain why here. One of these factors that may impede successful range shifts is this idea of climate change velocity. I mentioned that most species are expected to move upslope or poleward, or North America northward, to kind of track their climate, to track their suitable climate. If the climate is moving faster than a species can actually disperse and reproduce and disperse again, then species are unable to keep track of climate change or keep pace with climate change. So this map on the right shows the percent of mammals that are unable, or that are projected to be unable to keep pace with climate change. Mammals are actually, they have legs. They can move. There's a lot of species out there that don't have legs, can't move like all plants, right? Trees and mollusks, worms. lichens. So when you're thinking about a whole ecosystem that has hundreds to thousands of species, and they have dispersal limitations, and they can't necessarily keep up with climate change. So it's fairly reasonable to assume that there's going to be a lot of species out there that cannot keep pace with climate change. They cannot follow the climate as it warms and moves, say, northward or upslope. Another factor that can impede successful rate shifts is human land uses. You know, there's a lot of species out there that are sensitive to intense human land uses, and basically the intense human land uses can be a barrier to species movement. You know, in the Western US, we have a lot of open land or less intense human land uses and a lot of public land. So it might be less of an issue in Western North America or Western US, but there are other places like the Eastern US or Europe or Southeast Asia where, except for protected areas, there's a lot of intense land uses that can impede the successful shift of species. And the third factor that could impede successful range shifts is this idea of inhospitable climates, and like in between where a species is now and where its suitable future climate may be located. And I'm going to use the Sky Islands of the southwestern US and northern Mexico as an example. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Sky Islands, but there's these mountain ranges that shoot right out of the desert. So at the lower elevations, there's cactus and dry plants, and as you move up, you start to get to oak forests and even pine forests at the top. So if you're an organism at the top, though, and your future suitable climate is, say, north on an adjacent Sky Island, it's going to be very difficult, or I mean, probably impossible to get there. So you can see the arrow here on the left. If you're a tree or a plant or something else on top of the Sky Island, you need to move north. You can't get through this desert. I mean, it's hot, it's dry, and there's a bunch of prickly things, so it's tough. We're seeing, and we're expecting to see more of this, as species are basically just getting pushed off the top of the mountains because they can't move, they can't shift northward. So yeah, there's this triple whammy that's impeding successful range shifts. This idea of climate velocity being too fast, and this dispersal tolerances for organisms are exceeded, and then the landscape being inhospitable because of human land uses, and also the intervening landscape could be inhospitable because the climates may exceed the thermal tolerance for a given organism. So what happens here? We're going to likely see extinctions in wilderness areas, in national parks and other protected areas, or extirpations, which is a kind of a local extinction. So, wilderness boundaries are static and they're fixed in place, but the climate is changing. So we're kind of in a little bit of a pickle here. There's this paper that was published a few years ago I wanted to highlight in the Natural Areas Journal that used Isle Royale National Park as an example. And I know this is an island, but I think some of the lessons learned from this paper and from this island national park are relevant to this discussion. First of all, these authors suggest that many dominant species are expected to become extirpated. And they suggest that managers should consider assisted migration. And if we don't, or if managers don't consider assisted migration, stable ecosystems dominated by a few non-native taxa may result. So this kind of brings up the idea of intervening through managed relocation or assisted migration, which again is a form of trammeling, which goes against one of the key tenets of the Wilderness Act. So there's this tension between natural and untrammeled, and it's hard to imagine we can have both with this rapid climate change we're seeing. So I'm going to go back to a couple other word clouds I had done when I gave this talk a few months ago. I asked the participants to list the 3 risks or problems with intervening in wilderness to address climate change. And you can see that trammeling and unintended consequences are the kind of came up as the biggest. I also asked participants to list the 3 risks or problems with not intervening to address climate change. And you can see here, we've got extinction and habitat loss, biodiversity loss. So there are trade-offs. I just wanted to point out that we have this idea that wilderness, there's no interventions in wilderness, but I guess want to point out that we do intervene in wilderness. This paper showed that between 2011 and 2015, 37% of wilderness areas, or the wilderness units sampled, there were interventions. And I guess what my point here is that we need to recognize, I guess, that yeah, there's a risk associated with doing nothing. There's also a risk associated with doing something. Climate change is a human-caused phenomena. And I don't know, does that mean because we're causing the problem, that we should be helping ecosystems respond? I don't know the answer to that, but. So I'm going to come back to this, climate change being wilderness's greatest challenge. And I'm going to posit here that, that basically climate change in wilderness and dealing with it is a wicked problem. A wicked problem is difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements that are often difficult to recognize. A wicked problem refers to an idea that cannot be fixed, where there is no single solution. And because of complex interdependencies, the efforts to solve one aspect of a wicked problem may reveal or create other problems. So when we're thinking about climate change in wilderness and how to adapt and whether to intervene or not, there is no single solution. There might be a good solution in one wilderness area that's not a good solution in another. This last point about interdependencies and creating new problems, that's that idea of unintended consequences that that came up in that word cloud earlier. So this idea of the challenges or the trade-offs between doing nothing and doing something, or untrammeled versus naturalness, is starting to permeate the media, the popular media. Here's an article from the New York Times that was published talking about the brutal choices that national parks have to make to deal with climate change. I'm going to just go back to these word clouds real quick to show you what people in the previous seminar said these brutal choices are, and I think this pretty much sums it up pretty well. These brutal choices are trammeling and unintended consequences, or extinction and habitat loss. So with that, I'm going to turn it over here to David Lawrence to talk about the resist, accept, direct framework, because this is something that can maybe help us decide the trade-offs or what the appropriate response is to climate change in wilderness. Take it away, Dave.
All right, thanks so much, Sean. I am just going to pull up my screen here. Okay. Can you see my screen? Oops. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Dave.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
I can see your screen. It's not in presentation mode yet.
Okay. Let's see if that works.
Yeah, that's doing the same thing that Sean's was doing, but it should work.
Okay.
Unless you can change it.
Tim, it looks good on my end. All I see is a single slide.
There we go. That looks really good.
That looks okay. Full screen. Excellent. Well, thanks, Sean, for that. I think that was a really nice description of the challenge that we're facing. And again, I just introduced myself briefly here. My name is David Lawrence. I work as an ecologist within the Climate Change Response Program. And I've been part of a couple groups that have been thinking a lot on how do we respond to ecological transformation, many of which Sean highlighted in his presentation. And we've been thinking a lot about this resist, accept, direct decision framework as a way of approaching this issue. Before I go too much further, I just wanted to acknowledge that there's a couple groups that have really been the brain trust of a lot of the material that I'll be presenting today. This includes FedNet, which is the Federal Navigating Ecological Transformation Working Group, as well as a joint contribution from the Wildlife Society and the American Fisheries Society that has been focused on ecosystem transformation. And so both these groups have really been thinking a lot about the issue and have been publishing on the resist, accept, direct framework as one approach to help unpack how managers might respond to the issue. So I just wanted to define ecological transformation, and there are, of course, multiple ways and many different ways of defining what ecological transformation is, but essentially what we're describing it is a dramatic and effectively irreversible shift in multiple ecological characteristics of an ecosystem, the basis of which is a high degree of turnover in the communities. So that could be represented by a shift of a coral reef to a macroalgal dominated system, or the shift of a forest to a grassland. In terms of framing the problem of ecological transformation or ecosystem transformation, I think it's useful to think about it in this way. So we know that change has always occurred in ecosystems along with it. So paleoecology is a great discipline to investigate how the planet has changed through time. But we're facing this rapid directional change that's associated with climate change. This is often overcoming resilience, and that results in ecological transformations. And the cartoon on the right is just a reminder that we don't want to become so overly reliant on the concept of resilience that we become essentially blindfolded, and we may just walk essentially off this cliff into a transformation without having any idea that it's coming. So therefore, we advocate that we need some sort of decision framework that's explicitly designed to respond to these rapid transformational changes. So that framework that we've introduced is described as the RAD framework. It's basically a plurality of approaches to respond to transformation. The first of which is to resist, and we describe this as resisting a trajectory of change. And to resist, we work to maintain that ecosystem process, function, structure, or composition based on the historical baseline or acceptable current conditions. An alternative to that is to accept a trajectory of change, and that allows the system essentially to change without intervening to alter that trajectory. And finally, directing a trajectory of change, which is actively shaping these ecosystem process, function, structure, or composition towards preferred new conditions. And so this, of course, is in contrast to accepting, because we're trying to establish the conditions we want as opposed to those conditions that occur without intervention. And just to note that this component of the framework, of course, is the most challenging to pursue and unpack. So how does the RAD framework support natural resource decision making? Well, we think of this as a manager forward framework. It identifies specific manager actions. These are verbs: resist, accept, and direct. We argue that it encompasses all the potential responses to ecological transformation. There are no responses outside of this domain. And it's a neutral framework in the sense that we aren't advocating any one of these particular responses to a given landscape or ecosystem transformation that's occurring. And in fact, in many cases, we may ultimately deploy portfolios of resist, accept, direct, doing all of these in a particular landscape context or across the range of a particular ecosystem type. So why do we need the RAD framework? And the answer as we see it, is that we need some way to help managers make these unavoidable choices strategically. And Sean's talk was getting at this question of these unavoidable choices that we have to face in the face of climate change. So now I just want to transition briefly into some case studies. The first of which is in Sean's talk as well, and this is at the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. And this, the slides I'll be showing are really the work of John Morton and Don Magnus. John is he's retired now, but he was essentially led the wildlife refuge during his time there. And Don is a landscape ecologist that has done a lot of thinking about RAD within this landscape. And essentially, the Kenai itself is moving through this temperature and precipitation space. It's at the trailing edge of boreal forest under its current condition. And essentially, as the system dries and warms, it's moving across this biome diagram, and it could either pivot towards a grassland or it could pivot towards a temperate forest. And as described earlier, this transformation has already occurred on the ground in part of this a large portion of this landscape, driven in part by warming and drying, the spruce beetle outbreak, a wildfire, and then this spring fire that's essentially reinforcing this transition to grassland. And this is occurring within federally designated wilderness. So what are the potential responses to this type of transformation that's occurring? Science projects that if we essentially accept the trajectory, this is essentially going to be a deforested or depauperate grassland. The question is there potential to direct this system into a different ecological trajectory? And some of the potential outcomes of directing include nudging the system into that more temperate forest condition by planting lodgepole or encouraging the black-tailed deer that are already moving down towards this area. An alternative directing of the trajectory would be to direct it towards more of a diverse grassland, and that could include management actions such as prescribed fire or the introduction of a grazer. And John has talked about this in other seminars where he describes this as, the idea that doing nothing is really doing something, but often just incoherently or haphazardly. The RAD framework is, and John's been a big part of thinking through, is essentially trying to move from that implicit acceptance to an explicit acceptance. If you decide to accept in a system, that's okay. It's just, it should be done explicitly as opposed to implicitly. And at the same time, we should be thinking through what's the full suite of options? What are the opportunities to resist? What are the opportunities to direct? What are the outcomes of those decisions? And what's the outcome of accept? Sean also brought up Bandelier National Monument, so I'll talk about that just briefly here. Scott McFarland was the chief of resources at Bandelier, and he's described this in the context of RAD before. So I just wanted to use this case study just to think more about what resist, accept, direct looks like, particularly in a wilderness setting. So Bandelier National Monument is in New Mexico. It's a fire-adapted landscape. But a variety of factors, including the suppression of wildfires, has led to essentially fuels building up and big high severity fires like the Los Conchas fire in 2012, which essentially burned up about 66% of the monument itself. And the initial response to the wildfire was an accept response. It was no restoration and for essentially the first 8 years post-fire. And then there was a decision to resist the trajectory change, essentially to reintroduce beaver, which had been extirpated from this ecosystem for about 60 years, to reduce some of the impacts of drought on the system, pool water, and get water to stay longer on the landscape. And then in terms of directing, Scott describes this a series of actions that basically are intended to bring trees back into pockets of this landscape where they have the best chance of future survival. So they've planted out about 120,000 trees across the different federal land management units. And about 20,000 of those tree plantings were done in designated wilderness, targeting places that are north-facing slopes. And the way it's been described in terms of a directing action is that it's really nudging the system, planting on the margins of where these trees already exist or existed, essentially moving ponderosa to be more dominant in the mixed conifer forest, or moving pinyon into the ponderosa forest. Essentially, the system itself, as a result of climate change, is moving upslope, and so this is intended to kickstart the tree recruitment process in line with that movement. And the ultimate idea is that these plots will serve as seed source to expand forest in that way. So I just wanted to talk about sort of what is and isn't RAD. So I should note that RAD's it's not about embracing all change or going with the flow, giving up, et cetera. I like to joke, it's RAD, not AD. We are and still plan to resist ecological trajectories of change in many systems. So it's important to note that we're exploring all the possibilities. We're not going to stop resisting where we can do so strategically. RAD is and must be social. It involves real people in social ecological systems, and they have different value sets. And so the decisions across these across this spectrum of response, from resist to accept direct, are necessarily going to involve those folks that are going to be affected by changes in the landscape and the response thereof. And then just to note, RAD is not a policy, it's a tool. You know, we're really just trying to explore ways to respond to transformation. So just to conclude here, RAD as a framework is just, it's really one approach to enhance decision-making in the face of climate change. And we're trying to be explicit about recognizing all the options available. Applett and McKinley described that we can pursue portfolios of RAD. So we may resist, accept, and direct in different parts of the landscape, resisting to maintain or forestall the loss of diversity, except by learning about the changes and observing them if we don't do anything, and directing to prevent extinction and maintain key ecosystem services. And by deploying portfolios of these actions, we can support bet hedging and spread risk across the landscape. And then, of course, we're not talking about prescribing management choices on any given landscape. That is a local decision. But what we really need to do moving forward, and we're just starting to really unpack this, I think, is develop guiding principles of when and how to choose amongst these RAD options. And with that, I just wanted to mention some resources for folks that might be more interested in pursuing some literature around RAD. There's been just a flurry of papers that have come out really this year. Some of those are shown here. And then just recently, these are essentially still in press, but you can download them at this point. There's 5 papers that have been published in Bioscience unpacking different components of the resist, accept, direct framework. And John Williams wrote a nice introduction to that, describing RAD as it's a paradigm shifting. And then for folks interested in finding these papers or downloading different talks, watching different talks associated with the topic, you can go to the Climate Adaptation Science Center's website on RAD. And with that, I'd just like to really thank folks for the opportunity to speak, and thanks folks for attending the webinar. With that, I will turn it back over to Tim.